Welcome to the Cup of Joe Show, the podcast where Senator Joseph Cryan talks about the latest in New Jersey's 20th Legislative District. This week's guest, President of the New Jersey Energy Coalition, Erick Ford.
Welcome, everybody, to another Cup of Joe. I'm State Senator Joe Cryan, and absolutely thrilled that you're able to join us today for our continuing series of podcasts. We try to dive into the issues that are facing New Jersey today and to make sure that you, as a listener, walk away with an understanding of them and what we can do about them together. So today's focus is on the future of energy in New Jersey, the affordability of it, the innovation that is part of energy for all our lifetimes, and the infrastructure of energy. Anybody who's gotten their power bill knows just how important energy is, not only to the state of New Jersey, but also to each individual consumer as well. I am thrilled and really, really excited to introduce to you Erick Ford. Erick is, in proper title, Erick, tell folks what your title is.
Sure. I am president of the New Jersey Energy Coalition. I also serve as chair of New Jersey Seed's Energy Committee, vice president of Stevens Lee Public Affairs, and every day I get to play dad to three young, beautiful daughters. So those are my roles.
Best title in the world, Dad.
Thanks.
Yes, it is. So, Erick, to be candid, you're an expert in energy policy, and we've had numerous discussions about that. Clean energy development, so much of an important part of the New Jersey energy discussion today, and in public infrastructure as well. So thanks for spending a few minutes with us.
Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate this. It'll be fun. Talk about these issues. I'm not saying that sarcastically. I mean, there's major issues out there, and we got to find solutions to them.
So let's talk about what's kind of driving New Jersey at the moment. I think most folks would say if you need to know three things, it would probably be the state master plan on energy. You should also understand the role of both the BPU and PJM. And I was hopeful you could kind of take a few minutes and take us through that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. So my background before I took over the positions I have now, I worked at the Board of Public Utilities, worked with several of the commissioners over time, a lot of the staff, and had the ability to learn how the energy utility world works, how it's integrated, right? So to understand how our system in our part of the country is set up, it's different than other parts of the country. We are in what's called a market-based system that we gave to PJM back in the late 90s when we deregulated generation in the state. So what that meant was the generation that was being built in the state, that up to that point was being overseen by somebody within the state apparatus that was given to the market to figure out what to do.
So in kind of layman's terms, if PSE&G needed more power, they would hire somebody to generate that? Could you give an example?
Yeah, so what we had back before the deregulation was integrated resource planning. So to make sure there's a whole division that focused on making sure we had sufficient power and all that stuff. When we deregulated and became what we are today with the market that PJM runs and oversees, that is now driven by the market force of what those state regulations are, also what the marketplace is looking for, but also in terms of generation too, how states are procuring that generation. In New Jersey, we have a higher push for clean energy, right? Other states like Pennsylvania, yes, they like clean energy, but they also have an abundance of natural gas, right? So they have power plants that they're building now or power plants that they're also planning on building that can generate power for data centers and everything like that. But they're closer to the source, right? In New Jersey, our Board of Public Utilities is the regulator for the rates on the distribution side. So what that means is those wires you see in your town, those small wires coming to your house, that's the part the Board of Public Utilities regulates now. PJM oversees the transmission, which are the big wires you see that transmit the power from the power plants to the substations. Those substations are those big areas that all these wires are coming to, and you see, large transformers and whatnot that you see coming out of them. That's where the power is situated and changed out. So it's broken in a couple layers. And also above PJM is what we call FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They are overseeing PJM in a lot of senses, but they also have a lot of other things to oversee. So it's almost like baking a cake, right? You have different layers of who's in charge of what, and it all has to sync up at the same time, or the cake can be wobbly or out of sync in some way. The last several years, our state has gone through some changes, right? We've had an energy master plan that came out back in 2019, 2020, that took the state in a different direction that we were in at the time. And through rules, regulations, and everything else, our state has been able to move into a cleaner generation form. We've had, we've also been able to preserve our nuclear power plants in the state that produce about 90% of the clean energy in the state. So there's a lot of different things that had the markets work. But I'll tell you what, happy to answer any of those questions you want me to go through. I know you got a couple.
Well, I do want to make sure the listener kind of understands. So the BPU, which you have a history with and working with, the Board of Public Utilities, actually manages the rates that folks actually pay.
Yes, they manage part of it. So part of it is what's called the distribution charge, which is the local wires that PSE&G or JCP&L, Lancaster Electric own. And in your bill, you should be able to see how it's broken down into those different pieces where you'll see generation, transmission, and then distribution costs, right? So that distribution is really where they're focused on. That is where the Board of Public Utilities focuses on. The generation piece, that is the PJM marketplace.
Okay. So so the BPU covers the one piece. Now PJM, which is a multiple state coalition, or whether the right terminology is, I'm sure you'll give it to us, actually creates the market rate for those powers. There's bids. Actually, they call them auctions, correct?
Correct.
So can you define PJM a little more for the average listener?
Sure. So PJM, the history of it, just so you know, was created by 3 states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland. So PJM. So we are the J in PJM, as the former late president used to point out all the time. PJM's role is, let's go with the size of it first. So the size of PJM is New Jersey, Pennsylvania, all the way south to North Carolina, and goes all the way out to Chicago, all right? It's one of the largest, if not largest, RTO in the world, which means Regional Transmission Operator. Their job is 2 things: make sure there's enough power being generated, and making sure that power is moving to where it needs to go. They're not concerned about where it's generated. They're concerned about, do they have enough, and can it flow properly and quickly, right? And answer the needs that are needed in that region or in that area at that time. New Jersey is one of those areas. We're at the end of the line, right? So it's going to take a little more for us to get the power from West Virginia or Ohio or Western Pennsylvania than it does if it was made in Eastern PA or made here. It's just one of those things. Think about transmission as being the highways, and think about distribution as being the local roads. That's kind of how you have to think about it in a sense. And then who's overseeing those apparatuses for them to work, right? PJM, they have a couple different areas. One is the capacity market, which is one of the things we saw last year exponentially increase. The capacity market is based on various factors, but really at the end of the day, the power plant's able to bid into the market that PJM sees for the capacity market at a price level where they can make a profit, or if they're allowed to bid in, or if they can, right? Think about this in New Jersey. In the last 7 years, we lost 4,100 megawatts of power that was being made here in this state. We now import 4,300 megawatts of power from out of state, right? We're not the only state doing this, though. Maryland has a significant problem, too, where they're only generating now 40% of their power in state, which means they need to directly find another source from another state. Guess where that state is? Pennsylvania, right? So Maryland, by the way, Delaware, are having to be more reliant on another state, one state. So the market, as we would call it, needs to focus on how do we get more generation built in those other states too? But also, transmission is a key piece. The reality is, as population grows, you're going to have an increase of energy need no matter what. Think about this. 20 years ago, nobody had an iPhone. In my house, we have 6, right? We have 2 iPads. We have 4 smart TVs, as opposed to the TV that I used to have to get up and change on my own, right? Technology's changed a lot. It's required a lot more energy, but it also means we need to think about the transmission piece. As we see the growth and the need throughout the PJM system, we all also have to think about that marketplace we all pay into. So a transmission line in New Jersey could be beneficial to us. Those people in Ohio would have to pay for it too in some way. It's important to understand also, this issue wasn't just in the last couple of years. I remember there was concern with what used to be called a wheel out of North Jersey into New York City, where the wheel was turned off at some point. And this thing was the power. There was an agreement that New York State would send power into North Jersey. New Jersey would then send power into New York City, right? And there was a flow, basically called a wheel. At one point, the state of New York just turned it off. And that has to be accounted for in the PJM market, saying, well, that flow is not coming in anymore. So how do we make up that loss? Well, they had to find other generators, other lines, other systems to be able to solve that need, which then, if it's not available in that area, or something else, you have to think about transmission. Does that need to be built? Which probably it does, or maybe. Or are the power plants in that area, are they going to need to compete at a higher level, right, at a higher price? So there's a lot of factors that come into the market each time. But again, that PJM it's also made up of 13 states and the District of Columbia. So you have 14 member states, if you ever want to consider DC a state, that all have to deal with PJM at some point. So as we all know, it's very difficult in Congress to figure out with 50 different members from different states. But imagine the Mid-Atlantic and other parts of the country trying to agree on how to handle one particular thing. PJM is, I would say this, doing the best they can with the way they were set up. In the last hearing, they talked about some improvements that they've been working on, particularly what's called with their queue. That queue, if you think about it, everybody gets in line. Here's our power plant that we're looking to bring on. Not all those projects will ever come to fruition. A lot of them are smaller projects. Problem with that is some of those companies that get in line at PJM, some of them are just looking to sell their queue line. That's it. So PJM has been working on a process with FERC to figure out a way to bring on shovel-ready projects, which they're pretty close to getting that done. So I think once you see that rule and regulation finish up at PJM, then you start seeing projects starting to happen. The other thing is DOE, Department of Energy, has designated, I think, about 89 different sites around the country that used to be former coal plants that could today operate a small modular reactor there. So it's thinking about what new technologies are coming too, when that could happen. And I gotta be honest, I've been lucky enough to, since I left the Board of Public Utilities, be able to see a lot of this technology, meet these companies. There's a lot of great ideas. There's one company called Nano Nuclear Energy, where they've developed a power plant that is the size of a tractor trailer that can be hauled anywhere and plugged in place, right? Mm. Now, there's a couple other things, like how are you really going to transport that across roads? But
you don't want to be behind that truck on the turnpike.
Right. But it's, people are thinking about these ideas, right? So there's other technologies out there too, like fuel cells, like batteries and everything else. Okay. So,
So just to kind of summarize a little bit, and I'm looking forward to hearing you talk about some new technologies and things. But for the listener here who's kind of worried about their electric bill, they're reading the public comments and so on. Just summarize here a little bit. New Jersey is a power importer. Correct. We don't make enough power, to your point. 4,100 versus 4,300 in terms of megawatts. So therefore, we need to import, much like a state like Maryland. Therefore, we compete on a grid, on the PJM grid, via an auction, and we pay a higher price as a result of that because we're an importer. And is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. So we have the BPU regulating our rates, and then we have the PJM rates, as you've defined, both. And one of the questions I think a lot of folks would have here in New Jersey is, okay, I've read a lot about how we were going to generate a whole lot of power with wind, the offshore wind in particular, Atlantic shores and those sort of things. Can you give us an idea as to what's happened there and what the outcome of that potential loss of that power has meant?
Yeah. So, the Murphy administration had a big focus on offshore wind, and it was a big gamble. It was a great idea. It still could happen someday. I think when you look at offshore wind, though, you have to separate it into two, I'm going to say, buckets. All right, generation and then the transmission piece. Right. You can build the transmission in the water, and by the way, you can move any type of energy you want. It doesn't have to be just offshore wind generation. The offshore wind generation, that was going to be able to supply at least 7,500 megawatts of power. Now, you have to capture that power, you have to hold it for when you need it, things of that nature. But at the end of the day, you're still going to need to build other pieces of equipment, other generation somewhere in the state to help sustain the growth. I mean, think about this again. If we lost 4,100 megawatts of power, offshore wind is going to help with all that, right? Now there was solar. We're going to need all forms of energy that make sense to help fill the gap while also having to deal with the overall incremental increase, like 2 to 3% a year of energy that increases each year, that just a need, right? So, offshore wind, great opportunity, but as we sold these companies, it came down to the economics and the finance in the beginning. It doesn't make sense, and they had to make a choice what to do, right? And they made their choices. But my understanding is there's still a hope for this one day. Now, the other thing is New York is still doing things, all right? Will their system connect to New Jersey? It's a possibility. It's a thought, right? That is probably more realistic than anyone would think about, because you want to get to New York City, probably have to go through New Jersey, right? Just a reality. So.
And by the way, where in New York are those being built?
Called the New York Bight, just off of Manhattan and Long Island.
So in essence, as we talked about, we're an importer, and our master plan had designs on how to clear that out, basically by using offshore wind, cleaner energy, and the governor's focus on that. And for whatever the reason, and we all know that there are a number of them today, that option is no longer currently realistically available, at least in the short term. So as a result of that, we have a power shortage with higher rates. Is that a easier way for the consumer to understand that, or is that too simplistic?
I think that's kind of easy to understand.
Okay. So when the consumer looks at it and says, okay, I understand this now a little bit, I'm following along, what other alternative energies or things like that? You mentioned a couple, and I'd love to hear you share your expertise. What options are out there for that consumer, or for the state as a whole, as a power consumer, to maybe get on balance and see what alternatives are actually there for us? Yeah.
Well, before we go that way, how about let's think about this too. You have another department that regulates generation in the state called DEP. They regulate the emissions, right? They put together PAC rules over the years. Protecting against climate change, something like that, where they also put in emission rules that make it more difficult for generators to generate power. I do know power plants have shut down over the years because of that. That's been in the last 4 or 5. The question is, how do you get those repowered, right? Or how do you help them come back online in some way, right? And what does that look like? The emission rules, you could look at things like fuel cells. You can look at batteries, small turbines to begin with. Fuel cells are pretty impressive. I've got to see them up front all the time. I got to see them the first time when I worked at the Board of Public Utilities when I had no idea what they were. And I used to sit down with the senior policy expert and said, Mike, explain to me how this works. How does it actually function? He says, and he walked me through the whole thing, and I got to see a couple of them. And fuel cells, they don't burn. They don't do anything like that. What they do is they take a fuel in, and they separate it out, and through a chemical reaction, make electricity. And then, depending on the system, you can have byproducts of carbon capture, CO2, hydrogen, and obviously electricity. So you can have at least 3 to 4 different things if you wanted to. There's a market for the CO2 out there that companies like Coca-Cola are buying the CO2 from. The hydrogen world, that's always in question that will it ever exist, but it already does exist. So that's another area. For example, one company out in California, they're actually providing hydrogen to the vehicles coming off the boats while making electricity for the port, using the water for cleaning the cars. And if you wanted to, you can capture the carbon. Again, there's a market for the carbon, right? So that technology is pretty cool, and it's close to net zero, if not more, because if you sequester the CO2 or use it somewhere else, and then there's a whole other thing to do with it. Now, batteries are a good option. The problem with batteries is they'll last for a little while, right? 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. But how do you sustain that for longer if you need it? Texas is a good example, though. Texas had their blackout a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. Their solution was figure out how to get the technology on as fast as possible. And the amount of batteries deployed in Texas would just blow your mind. They realized that the opportunity was there. They saw the marketplace. They started moving the products in, and they're using the batteries now to balance the load better, which is smart. But also their market is set up different than ours. It's not run like the PJM market with the BPU. There it's run by ERCOT, and they have a different type of commission that's set up just for the utilities. So what they do there is they have a completely open market. So there's no capacity market. So, that's a different system they have there. And it today is working for them. A couple of years ago it didn't, though, right? So it's being nimble enough in a plan to adjust for the need and the reality. That's the most important thing to a plan. So, again, the technology out there that I get to see is pretty impressive. Fuel cells, there are some that already operate in our state. I know some data centers are starting to utilize them as well. I know Walmart and a few others in our state already have them on site. So, it's not a new thing. And then you have other systems like microgrids and everything else. So there's a lot of technology out there.
Would those things require change in the state energy master plan, or is it flexible enough that we could just grow right away?
The current plan, my understanding when they put out the plan, it was more of a guiding document. It wasn't a set in stone, right? Mm-hmm. So in theory, it should be adjustable, right? But remember, every year we have a budget. The clean energy budget has to go before the legislative branch to be approved, and the funding there can be allocated by legislators as they see fit, right? And at the same time, that funding is an opportunity how we look at transformational technology. By the way, fuel cells are already in there. CHPs, which is called combined heat and power, that's already in the budget. Microgrids are in there too. It's just how much money is allocated into it.
So, for example, in that pool of money, and there's quite a bit of it in there, right? We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. The legislature could, in fact, even in this cycle, say, okay, we know we're having issues with wind for the moment, and we know that right now that's just not a viable option to try to recover 4,300 megawatts of power a day. However, we have more promising technologies here that we potentially, if my colleagues agreed, could move investment in and potentially move quicker and be more nimble while it's not quite apples to apples like a Texas was.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And the other thing I would tell you is doing what I've been able to do, travel around the country, meet with these energy companies, but also, by the way, there's a whole nother world involved in this, the investment community, right? They look at it as state versus state from investability, right? If the signal is sent to the investors that this is a state that's looking to do something, they'll start talking to the people they work with to build stuff and say, all right, well, let's get our dollars moving there. Because, that's one of the most important things that, by the way, which I learned a lot when I was at the Board of Public Utilities, that we are in competition with 49 other states, right, for investments. And as much as we think about the Board of Public Utilities as being a utility regulator, they are just as much, if not more, of an economic regulator. Because what they do and how they deal with the rates, with those fundings, dollars, and rules and regulations, they don't just impact the utility as an operation. They directly impact the economic viability of a state. And by the way, every state has that, right? And that's something that has to be taken into consideration every time. My old boss, which you may know, Rick Morose, used to say to me, you have to think about this. Every time we have a meeting, we say something, you have to think about how that can impact a business, how that could impact the markets. We want to make sure that what we say is judicious, proper, correct, and can be fact-checked. Mm-hmm. And that's important, right? So what you're talking about with you and your colleagues, taking a look at something like that, that could send a signal to the investment community saying, hey, this is they're thinking ahead here, right? Something to think about. Our entire electric grid was created by two people. Thomas Edison, that we all know. By the way, J.P. Morgan, his investor. It's that simple, right? Thomas Edison could have figured out the light bulb, but without the dollars and investments with J.P. Morgan to help him finance it, to get it done, couldn't have done it. So it takes a team effort. It's like everybody looks at Walt Disney and says, look at what he did. Well, next to him was his brother Roy, figuring out the finances the whole time, figuring out finding the investments, right? So it's thinking about those two pieces together. And then also from the technologies that are out there, what ones make sense to help invest in, right? Hindsight's 20/20, but at the same time, it's what technologies are advancing, and so.
But those technologies talk a lot for our state and what we do in the future. But some of those demand issues are still going to be these data centers that we talk about, and folks, we all see AI and ChatGPT and that. Will they create more significant demand in the future?
They could.
Okay.
But the other part of it is you got to think about this way too. If our state is helping to attract those data centers, right? Will that also spur the development of more power generation being built in the state, right? And then on top of that, will that mean that then our capacity prices could come down, the auction prices from all over could come down, right?
Okay.
It's a question of, I get the concern, right? But also at the same time, it's a question of if you have someone that says, hey, but I need 200 megawatts, and the investor says, well, why don't we just build 300, and we'll go figure out a way to sell the other 100 megawatts to whoever else needs it, right? That's kind of the mindset that you want to see approaching, because data center is going to have that constant load no matter what. But the way our market is set up, you need a power purchase agreement with someone else to take the other megawatts, or maybe you do have a connection with PJM just to sell into the capacity market for the other 100 megawatts, right? Now, those are policy decisions that can be driven from legislators and the commissions and everybody else involved. So even EDA, think about this. The EDA, they oversee RGGI. That brings in a significant amount of money every year. What do you do with that money? That's a different bundle of money that, by the way, we're all paying for on our bills that say RGGI. Right. And you say, what do we do with that? So,
just real quick for our listeners, EDA being the Economic Development Authority for the state of New Jersey, and RGGI being the regional gas
greenhouse gas initiative.
Okay.
Yep.
So when folks look at their bill, and I hope they do because their bills are complex, let me shift it back a little bit more to the consumer. So if you're a consumer today and you're challenged, and as we've spoken about, and if they're in touch with the news, there's an anticipated double-digit 20% or more rate hike anticipated on one part of their power bill come July 1st, I believe, correct?
June 1st, yeah.
June 1st, my apologies. What approaches can consumers take? Can they look at solar for their homes? Can they look at reduced cost? Any ideas or any suggestions from? I know you're more in the
I'm happy
grid, but can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I would say there's one thing, the community solar aspect that's been pushed out there, and I'll be quite honest. When I first heard this idea 8 years ago, I did not understand it, and I sat down and met with a lot of people that were figuring this thing out, and the way in which it's done today, it makes sense, but you have to, sometimes you get a mailer or someone that will knock on your door for community solar. But at the same time, it's one of those things you kind of have to seek out at times. Could that help reduce your bill? Probably, right? The other thing is there's also energy efficiency programs out there. Be quite honest, the first time I did it was after I was at an event for the USS New Jersey where we changed out every light bulb on the battleship, and I saw how much of a reduction it was in the price for the battleship. So I said to my wife, we're going to the store tonight to go buy those light bulbs, right? The other thing is thinking about programs that are out there, like New Jersey Shares, LIHEAP, DCA has programs too that can help handle these, as we're going forward. There are programs out there for that. But looking at the overall reducing of cost, there are thermostats out there to help control your air conditioning, heating that are pretty smart. Now, my wife and I just had one put in last year after we had to get the boiler fixed after 50 years. So that boiler lasted 50 years. I'm 45, so, that was the first time it had to be replaced in my lifetime. But thinking about that, the technologies are out there. But the other thing is, if you're looking at the next 6 months, year or so, you got to think about what are you doing to help bring down your own costs. At the same time, it's a question of what programs are out there to help, right? I do know that there is a dedication, no matter who's at the BPU running at the time, to make sure that people can get the help they need for their bills. And look, to be quite honest, the most important thing any consumer should do when they get a bill that they know is high is call their utility and say, hey, how do we make this work? Be surprised. They might be surprised at any of the companies saying, well, we can figure out terms that last like 18 months, 12 years, or whatever's necessary. So they should call the utilities. They should call if they fit into one of the assistance programs out there, if needed, like New Jersey Shares, like LIHEAP. There's lots of agencies that oversee that too. But on the other part, it's also calling the utilities saying, hey, how do I handle this?
As my aunt would say, speak up for yourself.
Yes.
Right. Dial the phone and do that. And I also want to encourage folks, if they're listening, that they can also call our office here for help in terms of understanding New Jersey Shares and the others at 908-624-0880. So let me close this out a little bit. What's your view on the future? I mean, we've spent a lot of time talking about it. What's your view on the future of energy in New Jersey, and where do you see it going?
Yeah. That's a good question. I've had a lot of time to think about that. So I would say this. First off, we got to think about we're going to have a new governor next year. Whoever that governor is going to have to deal with this directly, and is going to have to work with the legislators and regulators, and also they should be focused on bringing in experts from not just New Jersey, but anywhere else that could give them good quality ideas to develop a plan, a comprehensive plan, right? Long-term, mid-term, short-term plan, what that looks like, how you can get assets deployed quickly. By the way, also how we're utilizing in-state assets, right? For example, today you have landfills that are releasing methane into the air by burning it off, right? Those landfills today could be capped instead, and utilizing that natural gas to either put into the pipelines for people to use at home, or put into the pipeline to make power, right? So we should be thinking about, from our perspective, what in-state assets do we have that we can be utilizing? Also, in addition to that, the current plants we have, what plants can we oversee that maybe just need upgrades? It's kind of like tuning up your car. I know it's more simplistic. If an engineer is listening right now, I apologize, but think about it that way. How can you get more power out of what you already have, right? And on top of that, think about transmission. Everybody hates transmission. They don't like it in their backyard, but it's a reality that as our society grows, we need that. So we're going to have to look at transmission. Is that a piece of it? But, we're going to need a plan that also spans longer than 3-4 years. We need a comprehensive plan that can answer the needs of right now, yesterday, and 5 years from now. It's difficult to plan 10, 15 years out. But if we do it right, we're working also with the utilities, we're working with the local communities, we're working with the investors, we're working with legislators, decision makers, policy makers, the experts, you can get a good plan. You can figure it out. And then again, the technology out there is just exponentially improving. I had a conversation with a company out of San Francisco last November, who their fund is focused on one thing, bringing down the amount of energy being used by the computer chip by 75%. Right? So you think about that. We think about AI data centers that are utilizing all this megawatts right now. But if you have companies like Meta and Amazon and others investing into that fund to do that research, to get that computer chip down 75%,
who knows?
That's a whole nother thing to think about, right? So there's a lot happening. It's important to know, with it all being developed, are we making sure we're being kept up to par on all the information out there?
Well, the energy sector certainly is challenging, interesting, and yet one of those that affects every New Jerseyan, no matter where you live, each and every day. I want to take a moment and say thanks.
You're welcome.
All right. Folks got an education today that a lot of people would pay a lot of money for. We've had the absolute pleasure and honor of talking to Erick Ford today, who is the president of the New Jersey Energy Coalition, among other titles, including the most important one. He's a dad of three girls, right?
Yep.
And with that said, I'd like to encourage folks, if you've listened here to us, you're still concerned about whether or not you need help with either energy costs or anything that we can help you do here at the Legislative Office, call us at 908-624-0880, and we're at 985 Stuyvesant Avenue in Union. Again, Joe Cryan, it's been a cup of joe, and a real pleasant one, I might say, with Erick Ford, the president of the New Jersey Energy Coalition. Erick, thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That's a wrap on this episode of A Cup of Joe, hosted by Senator Joseph Cryan. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll see you again for another cup.